Generali, partner di vita. Generali, partner di vita.
Buongiorno a tutti, buongiorno a tutti.
Good afternoon to all of you following us on streaming from all over Italy, more than 100 squares in Italy, and then all the other people from 5 continents in the world. The meeting is this year connected through this new way. And well, good evening and good morning to all of you that might be watching this video at other times. The meeting has never feared to face difficult subjects. Today, it might sound weird, but democracy is one of those subjects, indeed. Today's democracy is being questioned, and it is a hard time. But many times we have been hearing people saying, are we really sure that this system where everybody has the right to say his or her own opinion is efficient? Shouldn't it better to have just one individual ruling? Has this fight for democracy obtained something good? Is this meaningful? This is how I would like to introduce today's conference. We take democracy for granted, just like we have energy, we have cars, we have TVs, we have the democratic system. But those younger than 70 years old have been born in the democratic system. Our republic is 70 years old, so we really need to talk to our grandfathers that are really older than 70 years old to talk about a situation without democracy. It's something really unusual. We do believe that democracy is the ordinary system for a constitution. It is really taken for granted. But let's have a look at the world and see how things look like. We have an interesting picture here. Without going into detail, just have a look at the colors. Dark green and light green are full democracies, and all the rest are hybrid or non-democratic regimes. At first sight, you can really understand that it is not true that democracy today is a successful system, is the winning system. And to quote a great pope that we have mentioned many times in these circumstances, Benedict XVI, he used to say, conquests on a moral, social level, such as democracy, are not done once and for all. Every generation must regain them. Every generation starts again from the beginning. because in some way every generation has to reconquer the reasons behind those choices. So this is a really topical issue. Maybe we feel uncomfortable talking about it, but we have two great guests with us, and I'm really grateful to them. One of them doesn't really need to be introduced. I see he is smiling. He might have understood whom I'm talking about. I'm talking about President Luciano Violante. And he's not really a guest of the meeting. He is one of the hosts of the meeting, so to say. Hello, Luciano. Thank you, Andrea. Hello. And then, on the other side, we have a friend who might not be equally known to the Italian audience, but I'm sure that after this video, he will be very much appreciated and a lot of interest will rise for him. And very soon, a book that he wrote will be published in Italian. There is the Italian translation. This book had a great impact in the United States, and the title is really interesting, and it is Why Liberalism Has Failed. And I'm talking about Patrick Deneen, professor at the University of Notre Dame. I'm very thankful to him for being connected with us, because you had to wake up very early this morning. Is everything all right?
Magnifico. Allora,
Well, I will start right away with Patrick. We believe that freedom is the prerequisite of democracy. There is no democracy without freedom. That is, the freedom to express oneself is the foundation to have a democratic system. Now, in your book, you go against this principle in a way. The liberal principle that puts freedom at the center, you say it has failed. And paradoxically, it has failed in fulfilling the objective that it had. Can you help us understand better the core of this idea?
Yes, so thank you very much for the invitation to join you. Now, I've joined you under protest because next time I insist on being in Rimini rather than the Midwest of the United States. But I'm delighted to be able to speak with you today. I think we can begin with where you began, which is why in some ways our understanding of freedom has actually now reached a point where it threatens the practice and prospects of democracy. If we think about the definition of freedom, or I'll use the term that I use in my book, liberty. If we think of the definition of liberty, it's a very ancient word. Liberty is, of course, underlies the idea of the modern liberal political system. It's a very ancient word, the meaning of which in the classical times, if we were to study Plato or Aristotle, or read the scriptures, read St. Paul or even Christ in declaring, in seeking for us to be free of sin. The classical and Christian definition of liberty is a kind of freedom from the kind of bondage of the lower part of our being, the sinful side of ourselves, our appetites, our desires. We are most likely to be slaves, not necessarily by externally being prevented from doing what we want. Of course, that's a terrible form of slavery. But all of us, even if we live in a society in which we have no physical form of slavery, we're all subject to the slavery of being subjects to our desires. So the idea of freedom in antiquity was to achieve the condition through a kind of self-discipline of being free of those parts of ourselves. And this was an aim and ambition for both individuals. And this was, of course, an education in virtue. The idea of virtue being the central aim of education was to free us from the bondage of the enslavement to our base desires and appetites. But it was, of course, the ideal politically as well. To be a free society was to be a self-governing society, not to simply be rapacious, to be an empire that simply seeks to gobble up everyone else or to consume endlessly, but to be a self-governing community. And this ancient idea of liberty informed the idea of that other ancient word we're talking about, democracy, the rule of the people. And rule of the people has to be a kind of discipline in which we govern ourselves. We have the capacity to rule our own appetites as individuals and as polities. And the modern definition of liberty that undergirds the idea of liberalism is the freedom to do as we wish, is the freedom to pursue our desires. So it takes that ancient word and it redefines it. It defines it as the freedom from obstacles to fulfilling our wishes and our desires. And we could say that this modern understanding of liberty has required a transformation of our political understanding, certainly our social and our economic way of life, to permit the greatest expression of our appetites and our desires in order to pursue this idea of liberty. And as well, it has also transformed, of course, the scientific and technological sphere as well to allow us to pursue the greatest extent of individual liberty as we wish. But the problem lies in this redefinition and in this reordering of human society. When the aim of the entire political, social, economic, and technological order becomes the liberation of self, we really lose the capacity to govern ourselves together as citizens within a democratic context. And increasingly, we define democracy as the freedom to do as I wish, in which other people now become a threat to my liberty. Other people become a threat to my doing what I wish to do. And so the thing we call democracy now actually undermines our civic capacity and our ability to act as citizens in a self-governing way, both as individuals and as a political community.
Molto interessante.
Thank you. This is a very interesting analysis. So, well, at this point, I would like to ask Luciano, this evolution in the idea of liberty, this liberty that has become an insatiable desire, is gradually killing democracy. So I'm asking you, what do you think about this impact between liberty and democracy? Is this the end of democracy, or is it rather a transition, a change? First of all, I would like to thank you all for the invitation. I do believe I am, one of your friends, even though, well, I'm not officially one of the hosts here. So in White Russia, in Egypt, in Turkey and other countries, people are fighting for liberty, for freedom and for democracy. So we are those that are debating about something they have and others don't have. So, well, there is a part of the world where there is no democracy and people want democracy. And there is the other part of the world where people have democracy and are critical of democracy. So this is a paradox. The map you showed us. And if we had looked at it 10 years ago, it would have been different, because the number of democracies has decreased. So democracy has decreased. Why? Because mainly, and this is my impression, that this is not so much a crisis as a transformation of the world that needs new democratic tools. When the Pope said that we are not living in an era of change, but in a change of the era, he said something very focused. Times are changing. We cannot rely on continuity. The Pope is actually making new steps. And we have to do the same in terms of democracy. We believe that the tools of democracy that could be used 50 years ago, well, are they really useful today as they used to be? Well, there is a question that we should try to answer. There is a deficit of a gap, a lack of democratic political thinking rather than of democracy. In the book by Patrick, I believe is a very important book because it underlies some aspects of liberalism, and it talks about the lies of liberalism. And well, democracy is based on duties and rights. Otherwise, without duties, there is no democracy. And a democracy without rights is a totalitarian system. So this balance between duties and rights needs to be reconsidered. And then democracy is based not only on democratic political classes, but also on democratic citizens. Citizens that are responsible, so the citizen needs to commit himself or herself to democracy, and this is an aspect that needs to be underlined. Recently, some of Patrick's colleagues wrote a book on the fact that society needs to go against the Leviathan state. Obviously, citizens need to have rights that are granted by the state, but citizens also have duties, and this aspect needs to be underlined further. So the rights of the citizens, the duties of the citizens, and the rights of the political class. When the Berlin Wall fell, the two big areas were competing in a way. The West and the Soviet world wanted both to prove that they were the best option. When finally this bipolar system ended, we, in a way, in the West, thought we had won. But at the same time, there were processes underway that were, in a way, undermining democracy. So we need to understand if we are living a change of era, how can we translate this change in the different democratic institutions? This is really interesting. President Violante talked about the citizens. He talked about the fact that, as Patrick was saying before, there cannot be a concept of democracy without a sense of duty. We are used to thinking about duties as something negative. We have all totalitarian experiences in our past, so the idea of duties is something that frightens us. But so this is the difference between the model, the European model, and the American model, the US model. So Europe is centered around the state and the institutions, whereas the American model from Tocqueville afterwards is based on the strength and the powers of the civil society, of the citizens. So I would like to ask Professor Denini, who is really on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, what do you think about this trend we are describing? This erosion, so to speak, of democracy, this need to bring about a change, a transformation, as President Violante was saying. How do you see this from your point of view? Is there such a big difference between the two models nowadays?
I think when we talk about, it's right for us to talk about duties and responsibilities of citizenship. I mean, I think liberal societies are very good about talking about the rights that we enjoy and ought to enjoy as citizens. But it's much more difficult for us to talk about the kinds of duties that we should be expected and should be developed as citizens. These kinds of practices of duty don't come from nowhere. They don't simply arise like mushrooms in the morning. If you say you're a citizen and you have duties, I would say that the duties of citizenship, and I would be interested to know what the measures are for the map that you began with. What's the measure of whether you're a good democracy? And I suspect those measures include things like certainly voting, freedom to vote. But if we reduce democracy simply to voting, then we have a very minimal idea of what democracy is. It seems to me the duties of citizenship involve a far deeper steeping in the kind of activities and interactions of democratic citizens. And these would involve responsibly speaking in a way that is accessible to and inviting to fellow citizens, even citizens who may disagree with one. It's a requirement to listen and to listen seriously. And to weigh the evidence and the arguments that are made potentially by one's opponents. It requires the willingness to compromise, that is to say, to enter into the public sphere, recognizing that your position may change as a consequence of that listening and speaking. So deliberation and compromise. And I think it involves, in a certain way, the capacity to forgive, to grant a kind of grace on the political process that we sometimes think only as a religious quality, but I think it's essential. When we think about our political times, there's a kind of I would say, a kind of propensity not to be able to forgive one's opponents if one thinks one's opponents have done something that one can no longer accept. Now, where does one develop these kinds of civic capacities and duties? Now, I would say these capacities and duties as practices are developed in our everyday life. They're developed, first of all, one hopes in the family. Having to compromise and deliberate with your brothers and sisters when you're a child. They are developed in communities. They're developed through associations. They're developed through the practices of engagement with other people. They're developed in our local political order, and of course our national political order would be the kind of final space where these are delivered, and perhaps even the international political order. And when we look at the United States and Europe today, what we can say is those spaces for the development of our civic capacities and our capacity to develop democratic duties and obligations, those are deeply damaged. And even have been so severely weakened that it's not clear how they can be strengthened. Now, for many years, the past 40 or 50 years, there's been a debate between, broadly speaking, the American conception of liberty, which has emphasized economic liberty and the need for a minimalist state, and the European idea of liberty, which has emphasized the need for a much more social economic sphere, and therefore a far greater place for the state in the distribution of goods, in the distribution of benefits, and so forth. And what's striking is if we look today at the measurements of the health of those institutions, those civic institutions, and even somewhat more private institutions, the health of family life. Are people getting married? Are people having children? What is the strength of our communities? What is the strength of our associations? What is the strength of our religious institutions? What is the strength of our sense of sociability? What are the numbers of friendships that we have? What's our sense of connectedness intergenerationally? What's our sense of duty to those who were born before us and those who will come after us? And what's really striking is that in spite of the debate that's taken place between the United States and Europe about the best way to pursue this modern idea of liberty, of the freedom of the self, the consequences is that the two systems in some ways are converging. And they're converging for, it seems to me, reasons that we can in some ways predict and foresee. That in a system in which that prizes individual liberty and the economic sphere, we will become so free economically that we no longer, in a sense, have the capacity to understand our civic duties to each other, that we will think of ourselves solely as individual economic actors. And this economic logic has lodged itself into almost every aspect of American life. Right? We talk today of our students, for example, in universities as consumers, which is an absolutely insane way to describe the relationship of a student and a teacher or a student within a university. But we can also say that a society in which largely our obligations and duties flow to our relationship to the state will tend to undermine the reliance upon and our needs for those institutions that lie below the level of the state. And so our civic capacities will be weakened if our only sense of duty is really through the exchange of taxation and benefits from the individual to the state. And so after this 50 years of debate, which system is the best, America or Europe? Which is the best way to secure the ideals of a kind of modern democracy? I think what we've seen is that both have deeply undermined our civic capacities, and they're becoming almost identical in a sense in terms of the undermining of our civic institutions, our familial institutions, our religious institutions. And they're faced with a similar crisis in this deficit of democratic capacity and our ability to practice democratic citizenship.
Well, I must say that I'm really impressed by listening to Professor Denin. When you talk about forgiveness in the political debate, grace, well, as President Violante was saying before, without an idea of a connection, a duty, and the readiness to forgive, which is something that seems to belong to the religious sphere, but actually it does belong to the social sphere as well. Institutions collapse, and this crisis, and as Professor Denin was saying, the two systems which were very different are now converging. So now I would like to move to the heart of our meeting, because there is another word in the title of our meeting, confidence, and these are exactly on trust. And I would like to ask Luciano Violante, who spoke about this need to be able to provide an example that can bring about a new form of solidarity. So what is the problem today? We have, in a way, the impression that there is no trust anymore. Citizens don't trust institutions anymore, but also vice versa. Institutions don't seem to trust citizens anymore. So they issue thousands of rules and regulations because they have no trust. So how can we rebuild this relationship?
Assolutamente condivisibile.
Well, your observation is really interesting, and I agree with that. I would like to refer to Italy. During the pandemic, we have had an explosion of trust, in the sense that citizens trusted institutions. They complied with rules, even very stringent rules. And this was the case in the majority of cases. And on the other hand, institutions trusted citizens. They were following the progression of COVID. They were trying to soften measures or to increase measures where necessary. So there was a dialogue between the society and the citizens and the state that was really important from the point of view of mutual credibility. So what is trust? Trust is moral trust, refer to a category that you mentioned the other day when I was talking to you, an expression by Don Giussani, the moral certainty of the other person's reliability. And what is this? It is the trust in the thoughts and in the words of the others. When I trust you in terms of consistency, that you will be consistent in your words and actions, I will trust you. And if this is the case, trust will increase. And trust is a mutual process. I trust you if you trust me. It is hard that you trust me if I don't trust you. So this is a mutual process. And I think that this is something on which people should work more and better. First of all, there should be more importance attached to this aspect. Within a community life, within a society, it means that there are more people acting, interfering with each other. We interfere with the activities also of public subjects within a system that we trust. When there is the stop signal in a road and we stop, of course, we trust that people will do that without having accidents. So there's a lot of activities that are based on the principle of trust. And I think that the current political system should reconsider this. Not just, as you said, Andrea, in the sense of citizens' trust towards public institutions, but also on the other way around, that is the trust of public citizens, of public institutions towards citizens. Well, we have gone through a phase in which political institutions pointed to a society of purity, and this is really bad because these are violent contexts. I think that this stage now is over, but basically that kind of system were very much based on the penal order to rule society. So I'm referring to laws that were issued based on suspect. But these laws must be put apart, put aside, and our relationship must be based on trust. Of course, those that commit crimes must be punished. But from this point of view, I think that American institutions can teach us something, because for some aspects, I think that there is a higher degree of trust towards the citizen than is the case in Europe. This is different in other countries. For example, my German friends told me that the support contributions were provided very quickly to the citizens in Germany. So, as I said, this relationship of trust should be compared in different countries, but as regards Italy, the subject now is really important in order to dismantle that kind of regulations that are more based on suspect and lack of trust, as if everybody was a criminal. And I think that this is a mistake that must be overcome. Thank you, Luciano. Yes, that's right. We are seeing more and more a kind of paradoxical situation where citizens find it hard to trust institutions that could not prove to be efficient in a time where that was needed. And on the other side, we have institutions that keep considering the society as a potential enemy. So I will move to the final question now that I would like to ask all presenters today. And this is the aspect that characterizes the meeting in a way. It's not just an analysis of the situation. It's not just a deep analysis that was delivered by two distinguished scholars. Could you tell us a positive point from which we can start? So, considering this situation with a crisis of liberty that paradoxically is destroying itself, and before the erosion that this is producing in institutions, there is a lack of trust. So where can we start again? What is a point that we can use to leverage again and to start rebuilding something? Both in the message by the Pope sent to the meeting, the message by Monsignor Parolin, and also by the President Mattarella and President Draghi, they all mentioned the young people. that there must be more attention to the young people, those that are building their life. This is central for the meeting and for the future. So I will start with Professor Denis. Where can we restart? What are the fundamental points to restart?
So I think the answer to this question, especially as I just discussed it in my last comments, for many, many years, 20, 30, 40 years, has been that we need to strengthen civil society, that we need to strengthen those institutions that I was talking about in my last response. These would include strengthening, of course, the family, strengthening communities and associational life, the voluntary civic associations that Alexis de Tocqueville praised when he visited the United States. It would, in a sense, require us to, on the one hand, bring public and civic life closer to the people, away from its centralization, whether in Washington, D.C. or in Brussels in the European Union. But it also requires us to draw people out of themselves, out of their individual pursuits, into a civic life. And now, this answer has been discussed and recommended for many, many years, and I agree entirely with it. But I think maybe one of the challenges that this answer has always met is that it hasn't confronted the deep power dynamics that make the current liberal system beneficial for a relatively small number of our fellow citizens. In other words, what we have now seen is the creation of a new kind of oligarchy, or what in my book I call a new aristocracy. The system that was supposed to result in the elimination of the old aristocracy has actually given rise to a new kind of aristocracy, an aristocracy that enjoys the benefits of the form of liberation that frees us from people, from places, from nature, that allows us to pursue our own individual goods without having to, without being required to have mutual obligations to our fellow citizens. These are the people who can live in a borderless world, in an unbounded world, a world in which they can enjoy their individual liberty more or less unobstructed. So I think, frankly, a constructive answer to this question is to return again to this ancient teaching, which argues that we have to be wary of the creation of an oligarchy that benefits from sort of systemic advantages, and in particular governs over the many without really respecting or understanding their circumstance. In other words, I think that the division that we see across the Western world today, it's a division that defines much of Europe. Certainly, I think it's there in Italy. It's certainly in the United States. It pits an increasingly liberal elite against what we now call the populist right or populism. This division, which is recognized by ancient philosophy, is regarded as the poison that will destroy any political order, any political regime. When the few and the many are directly hostile to each other in a political society, in a political order, it spells the end of that political order. It will result in either internal decay or outright civil war. I think there's a special obligation then on the part of what we call the elites today, the people like myself who teach in elite universities, the people who run the cultural, political, economic institutions in the world, to develop forms of certain kinds of democratic virtue. I think it's a great responsibility among our elites. First of all, what's needed is a kind of democratic respect, a greater respect for the concerns and the plight of the many who are not benefiting from the order of individual liberty that we have created. In many ways, who tend to have more rooted forms of loyalty, who tend to be more limited in their ability to enjoy or their desire to enjoy a world of unlimited freedom, who rather are oriented to more local forms of life. There needs to be a kind of democratic respect for the ordinary person, but also a kind of project to elevate the condition of ordinary people, not to insult them, to denigrate them, to condescend to them, but to inspire them, to lift them up. It was always understood that those who benefit from greater enjoyment of prosperity and wealth have an obligation to elevate the lives of those who are not so well positioned. And so what are our elites doing in many ways to elevate not just the civic capacities, but our capacity to appreciate beauty and to enjoy the cultural inheritances that we all ought to be able to enjoy. And I think this is ultimately the basis of trust. If those who are more powerful and more wealthy than us, if the many think that they are working on our behalf, then there will be trust. If, however, they think that basically the system is rigged against ordinary people, and that the relatively small number of people that enjoy the benefits of this liberal system will increasingly separate themselves from the ordinary person, then we will have deep and divisive distrust as a fundamental condition of our polity. And if we call that democracy, then that is a failure. It's a complete contradiction of what the idea of democracy should be. So the restoration of democratic trust, I think right now, requires a great commitment and responsibility on the part of the wealthy and the powerful, increasingly to develop forms of democratic respect, democratic virtue, and democratic trust.
Grazie mille, Patrick. Luciano.
Thank you, Patrick. Luciano, now you have the honor to close. Well, I'm happy that Patrick talked about trust, and I share his view on respect, which is fundamental in a society based on trust. We need to create horizontal relationships, communities based on trust. So the behavior of individuals on the part of the governing classes as well as citizens. With reference to the governing classes, in a way, politics means also to carry out a pedagogical role. You need to transfer values and rules. So we experienced a period of time when we had a political class that was in a way vulgar, and the whole many citizens became vulgar as well. Then we had a period of time when the government or the political class was racist, and most of the citizens became racist. So the behavior of the governing classes is an example for the society, for the citizenship. So we need also to ask a behavior that is based on trust also on the part of citizens. And I don't want to preach, but we need to create widespread behaviors of mutual trust between people and between the citizenship and the institution. And this, in a way, can solve also the problem of the future of democracies. Well, I'd like to really thank Professor Denin and Luciano Violante. This dialogue, I think, has been really light-shedding. We understood how some elements, some factors, which we often neglect. But if we look at the story of the meeting, these were the fundamental values of the meeting. That is to say, we need places where we can experience virtues, because respect, this democratic tolerance that we desperately need at the moment. Otherwise, we can face the collapse of our system. This continuous conflict between a new oligarchy and a class of people that are excluded. Well, these behaviors that can bring about, that can inspire the virtue of patience, tolerance, respect, friendship, dialogue, well, all these things cannot be artificially created. There is no medicine, there is no pill that can magically bring about these factors. You need to learn by looking at others and realizing that you can live this way. And so this is actually the value of events like the meeting that talk about democracy and respect, but also try to behave with respect and democracy. Even if this year we decided to choose a digital model to reach everyone. So I would really like to thank once again Patrick Deneen on the other side of the ocean and Luciano Violante, and I already invite you both to Rimini, hoping that you will be able to come here in Rimini, Professor Deneen. And I invite you all to go on visiting the different sites of this special edition of the meeting 2020, and please follow our streaming events in streaming, even if you are on the beach, and please also follow the suggestions that our guests gave us. Trust is originated by trust. So this is our main invitation. Thank you.
Generali, partner di vita. Generali, partner di vita.